You left Russia, got citizenship or a residence permit, walk around American and European cities, your children are learning a new language, a new culture, and everything else. It seems like all the worst things are behind you, back there in the past. And then you find out that at some point your phone turned into a bugging device. A special spy program got full access to your camera, microphone, messages, contacts, to your entire life. So, in 2023, hackers hacked the phone of Galina Timchenko, the head of the Medusa publication, when she was in Berlin meeting with other independent journalists. The Russian authorities are putting more and more pressure on those who have left the country through their relatives who stayed behind. For example, the father of Navalny's associate Yuri Zdanov has a criminal case against him. Other activists say that their sons are being threatened with military draft notices in response to the activists' activities abroad. Families from Siberia and the Far East say that their children are being sent to serve in the most dangerous units, or they are deprived of the opportunity to study just because their parents continue to speak out, even while living abroad. These are all elements of one system, a system in which the system, Russia, is trying to control and intimidate its citizens and former citizens far beyond its own territory, using assassinations, spyware, and pressure on relatives, basically anything they can come up with. In this video, I want to talk about how this machine operates in relation to the Russian-speaking diaspora, what happens to immigrants and their families, and whether we have any chance to be safe and still speak out. It doesn't matter if you left 20 years ago, just recently, or if you've never even been a citizen of the Russian Federation but speak Russian. The issue of safety and Russia's influence in the countries where we live still concerns you, because those in Moscow have decided that it concerns them. In recent years, Moscow has been acting more and more aggressively not only inside the country but also beyond its borders, from attempts to influence elections and information campaigns to directly intimidating immigrants and putting pressure on their families. This phenomenon has been called transnational repression, when a state persecutes its critics and opponents abroad, using everything from espionage and surveillance to Interpol and threats against relatives. In this video, I will break down which Russian organizations, how they work with the diaspora and for what purpose, how surveillance is organized, informants, and pressure through relatives, what risks await activists, journalists, and ordinary people who simply speak out openly abroad, and most importantly, safety rules. How can you reduce, if not completely eliminate, the risk? It's impossible to avoid risk completely, but it's definitely possible to reduce it significantly. Let's start with the question: why does Russia even need a Russian-speaking diaspora abroad? The official version goes like this: protecting the rights of compatriots abroad. I by no means consider myself their compatriot, but since I speak Russian, that means they are my compatriots. Development of culture, the Russian language, monuments, festivals, Russia Days. The Regiment March. A whole set of organizations is responsible for this, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Rosotrudnichestvo to the newly created Foundation for the Support of Compatriots. All of these are absolutely spy organizations, instruments of pressure, nothing more. But besides the cultural cover, there is also a political layer. The diaspora is involved in elections, they have elections there, and the diaspora can deliver a certain number of votes. These are organized communities that can take to the streets, write petitions, and influence local politicians in different countries. The Kremlin tries to use this as an element of soft power. Through cultural centers like the Russia Houses, associations of compatriots, and similar organizations. In some cases, such structures become channels for promoting a pro-Russian agenda. Participation in rallies against Russophobia, yes. Organizing campaigns against sanctions or in support of certain politicians in Europe and other regions who are favored, liked, or promoted by Moscow. At the same time, we see another side, the shift from soft influence to intimidation. The Russian authorities are increasingly relying on open displays of force and intimidation, including abroad. From poisoning former intelligence agents and killing Chechen opponents in Europe, to criminal cases against immigrants and accusations of fake news and extremism for social media posts. So you're sitting in England, in America, in Canada, in Israel, and you either repost or write yourself no to war? They don't like it. For a single interview and a few posts on Telegram, former state TV host Farida Kurmangalieva, while living outside Russia, was convicted and sentenced in absentia to 8 years in a penal colony. If he falls into their hands, Yevgeny Chichvarkin will serve time. I think many people know him. The former owner of Euroset has been living in London for a long time, for a very long time, and is a very outspoken critic of the Kremlin. In February 2026, just recently, the court sentenced him in absentia to 9 years in a penal colony for spreading fake news about the military. He is a businessman, he lives in Britain, and he faces criminal charges in Russia for his speeches in the West. The liberal politician left Russia, but in 2023 a case was opened against him for spreading fakes about the army. The reason was his posts on Facebook and Telegram. He already lives abroad, he posted them, but he has nothing to do with them. According to OVD, in 2025 there were 46 new cases under Article 207.3, fakes about the army, mostly for anti-war statements, and at least 15 cases under Article 283, that's discrediting the army. Among them are cases against journalists, including 4 employees of TV Rain, who had already been working outside of Russia for a long time by the time the case was initiated. So they report something on some channel, Russians don't like it, and they set up a trial. And they wait for the moment when these people will be caught. Transnational repression is when a government tries to control, intimidate, or punish its citizens or former citizens outside the country. I'm 51 years old, not a citizen. I paid to renounce my citizenship. They sold me the renunciation. Nevertheless, I speak Russian, which means I can be the object of their special attention. Russia is consistently among the leaders here in terms of the cruelty of its methods. Their arsenal includes surveillance and hacker attacks on activists and journalists, as well as threats to relatives. Thank God I don't have anyone. Criminal cases remaining in Russia for posts and statements made abroad, abuses. So they managed to use Interpol and international legal assistance to persecute their opponents. Of course, they lie to Interpol, but their main goal is to do something nasty to you, to make you afraid. In recent years, digital surveillance has been added to the traditional methods. Research groups are documenting cases of commercial spyware being used against Russian-speaking journalists and activists in Europe. One investigation identified at least 7 cases where the phones of Russian and Belarusian opposition journalists and activists living in Europe were infected with spyware. Pegasus, the same spyware that has already been involved in numerous scandals. Such attacks allow hackers to read messages, access contacts, the microphone, and the camera, effectively turning the phone into a pocket bug. For people who are already at risk, this is a blow to their personal safety and the safety of their sources. They hunt those who provide them with information. One of the most painful tools is pressure through relatives and the border. And those who oppose the war and the regime are increasingly facing the fact that law enforcement officers come to their parents, brothers, and friends, even in Russia, summon them for questioning, and threaten them with criminal charges, or simply the loss of a job for the rest of their life. They took my relatives to the war. That's how one of the activists who left Siberia but left her family in Russia describes what's happening. The Moscow Times. It is stated directly, the persecution of relatives and critics is a long-established scheme. But with the start of the war, this practice became widespread, sending people to war, public renunciation. There have been interrogations, searches, and threats of sexual violence. Human Rights Watch specifically describes how the relatives of emigrating activists were detained en masse, held in custody, and threatened in order to force the activists themselves to remain silent abroad. This creates a constant sense of guilt and inner conflict. Should you continue your public activity if your loved ones are paying the price for it? Many activists openly state that it was the fear for their loved ones that made them reduce their activity or even leave the public sphere altogether. But despite all this, Russian speakers abroad are not only objects of pressure, but also political actors in European countries, the US, Canada, Israel, and others. The Russian-speaking diaspora has become a significant political factor. People take part in anti-war rallies, help refugees from Ukraine, support political prisoners, and interact with local lawmakers. Russian speakers can vote in local and national elections, participate in parties and public organizations, and work with local NGOs and human rights groups. There are already examples where Russian speakers have helped raise the issue of transnational repression and foreign interference in national parliaments. They participated in investigations and reports that describe the practice of intimidation and interference by Russia and other authoritarian regimes. There are several well-documented examples where Russian speakers have raised the issue of transnational repression and Russian interference at the level of parliaments and major international institutions. Well, for example, the researcher from Freedom House, Yana Gorokovskaya, who is originally from Russia, works on the topic of diaspora and repression, and regularly appears as an expert before the U.S. Congress and the European Parliament, including Russian persecution of immigrants and diasporas. A hearing was held in the House of Commons Committee on Public Safety about foreign interference and transnational repression, where representatives of the Russian-speaking community, including Yuri Novodvorsky, testified as witnesses. He founded the Russian-Canadian Democratic Alliance. At this hearing, specific cases of pressure from Kremlin affiliates in Canada were discussed, such as surveillance, threats, and attempts at influence. Russian-language media and organizations, as well as Russian-speaking participants, directly explained to the MPs how Moscow's intimidation through the diaspora works to influence the countries where we have settled. In 2023, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe adopted the report Transnational Repression, where Russian murders, assassination attempts, and pressure on immigrants were named the most egregious example. State programs for persecuting dissidents abroad, the most egregious example. The report describes attempts to kidnap journalist Roman Dobrokotov in Berlin, the abuse of so-called Interpol red notices, threats, and surveillance targeting Russian immigrants, and emphasizes that this is not a local problem, but a threat to the sovereignty of the countries that have taken us in. Lobbying is a word that sounds almost like a curse word in the post-Soviet space, but in essence, it's simply organized work to promote an interest. Russian-speaking communities are already doing this. They explain to local politicians how repression works in Russia, push for sanctions, support aid programs for refugees and political immigrants, and speak out against the deportation of people who face persecution. The more organized these efforts are through associations, initiative groups, and foundations, the greater the chance that the voice of the diaspora will be heard. If you live outside of Russia and speak out openly, a few basic safety rules are now becoming the norm. First of all, digital hygiene. You shouldn't use the same phone and accounts for your personal life and for sensitive activities. Enable two-factor authentication, update your device, and be suspicious of strange links and attachments, especially from unknown senders. Secondly, think about the safety of your loved ones. Discuss with them in advance whether they are ready for possible police visits or questions about your activities. What are their red lines? Sometimes it's better to reduce the visibility of certain connections in advance, rather than trying to delete everything in a hurry later. Usually you can't erase it all. Third, don't stay alone. Russian-speaking activists, journalists, and just concerned people find support from each other, as well as in local and international NGOs that focus on human rights and support for immigrants, psychological help, psychological support, and even basic everyday assistance. And finally, it's important to remember that fear is part of the toolkit of any authoritarian regime. The goal of such systems is to make you stay silent even thousands of kilometers away from their borders. But it is Russian speakers abroad today who have a unique freedom of speech and the ability to influence the politics of the countries where we live. If you live in the US and feel pressure from Russian security services, it's important to immediately switch from seeing it as a personal problem to defending yourself in the country where you now live. Signs that this is no longer paranoia, but actual pressure. This is when people call or write to you, introducing themselves as consulate employees, journalists, or old acquaintances from certain organizations, and hint that you shouldn't be speaking out publicly like this. They suggest meeting up to discuss cooperation. They talk about your parents, children, sisters, or brothers in Russia, saying they could have problems and ask why you need all this. They blackmail you with old cases, compromising material, military service, trying to intimidate you as an immigrant. At this moment, the main mistake is to pretend that nothing happened, to think, I don't want any trouble, and just delete the message. On the contrary, you need to document everything. Don't argue or agree. Don't try to justify yourself. Explain your position or engage in long correspondence. Any dialogue gives the other side an opportunity to keep pressuring you, twist your words, and use your answers as evidence of anything. The minimal and safest scenario: don't click on links, don't open files, don't agree to meetings or to talk in a cafe. If the conversation has already started, end it neutrally, without conflict, but keep all the evidence. You should document everything from the moment you realize you've been contacted. Your task is to collect a folder of evidence, screenshots of all messages, emails, chats, photos of the screen if necessary. Record the dates, times, phone numbers, and links to profiles. If there was a call, make a note of who said what and what exactly they threatened you with. All of this will be useful. If you decide to contact the American authorities or a lawyer, this is considered evidence in America. They will check everything anyway, and without evidence, it will be your word against theirs. In the US, you are not snitching. No one sees your report that way. So how should you start acting after that? From the perspective of any U.S. authorities, to protect your new country from foreign intelligence services, you need to contact federal agencies. In the U.S., foreign intimidation of immigrants is considered a serious security threat. You can contact your local branch of federal law enforcement agencies online, by phone, or in person. In an emergency, call 911. In an emergency, immediately state that you are afraid of pressure from a foreign government. Phrases you can use include, I believe I am targeted by agents of a foreign government, or I am concerned about. Transnational repression and threats against me and my family. When you go to the meeting, bring all materials with you. A folder, a flash drive, print screens, messages, phone numbers, names, screenshots, profiles, and call recordings. If there was one, you can understand that you have rights, and also before American authorities. The basic strategy is to calmly explain what happened and hand over all the materials. If you feel unsure, just say directly, I prefer to speak to a lawyer before answering detailed questions. You have the right to an attorney and the right not to answer questions if you're not ready. This is standard practice. It doesn't look suspicious. On the contrary, it shows that you understand your rights. It's hard and dangerous to go through such situations alone. You should find an immigration or human rights lawyer through local legal aid or the ACLU. or organizations that help refugees and dissidents get in touch with NGOs that work on human rights and the protection of immigrants and victims of persecution. If you are a refugee, inform your lawyer or the organization that handled your case. Pressure from security services strengthens the arguments for a persecution claim. It may help them get all the American documents faster. Of course, the most difficult issue is a few practical things in Russia. Discuss with them in advance how they will respond to visits and calls from law enforcement officers. The main thing is that it shouldn't be a shock for them. Don't post unnecessary personal information about your relatives publicly, especially if it's connected to your activities. Think about which chat conversations might put them at risk. Sometimes it's better to switch to more secure communication channels for safety reasons. Separate your personal and activist lives across different accounts and devices and use two-factor authentication. Keep your system and apps updated. Don't install software from suspicious sources, and treat every unexpected attachment or link as potentially harmful, especially if you're a public figure. The main thing is not to stay silent. The main thing is not to stay silent and not to shut yourself off. It's always meant to make you scared, to make you go into hiding, to make you stop speaking out. That's what they want, to make you shut up. The best strategy is not to stay alone. Connect with other Russian speakers, with local activists, with journalists, with NGOs. If necessary, share your story anonymously with human rights defenders or the media. Publicity, strangely enough, often protects better than silence. I think that publicity, not just often, but probably always, or almost always, everything I can think of, publicity protects. So I strongly recommend it to you. Personally, I haven't encountered this myself. There were a few strange attempts, but of course I remembered all of them and so on. I didn't respond, didn't react in any way. There was one attempt, kind of strange. I didn't even understand where it came from, actually. I decided it was from one source, but then realized it was from a completely different one, so I replied and started a conversation. But as soon as I noticed something strange, it became easier for me. I made a broadcast about it and it stopped immediately, right away, just like that. I understand that most of you can't make broadcasts. In any case, make it known, put it on. With the data, with all the phone numbers, with everything you found out, with screenshots and so on, posted on your Facebook or YouTube. That's a little bit for that. On X, on Telegram, on Instagram. Telegram is probably Russian, Instagram, on all the others. So, gentlemen, at first it's a shock. You start to fear for yourself, fear for your loved ones here, fear for your loved ones there. But when you face it openly, they back off. They don't want to be picked out like raisins from a bun either, and thrown back into their trash bin, which is somewhere in the Moscow region. Terrible. What a country. Terrible, what a country. So there's Iran, and these are probably more about China. I don't know. Maybe China too, but Iran and Russia are just some kind of scummy, crappy mess. Goodbye.